Hello, I'm Charles McKittrick, and this is going to be a series of discussions about my life. I was born on July 7th, 1929, in Memphis, Tennessee, and I'm going to be 90 years old in a few weeks. And I thought that by stepping through some of the many things I've done, you might find it of interest and also see some of the lessons that I've learned as I've moved through these years. Over the years, I've lived in 20 different cities, several of them more than once, and 26 different residences. And within IBM, where I worked all of my life, within IBM, I had 10 different positions over the years. I'm going to start out and say a little bit about my mother and father. We're going to make another videotape about family history that's going to go into much greater detail. But my mother and father both came from the Midwest, from Madison County in Illinois, which is a largely rural county, across the river from St. Louis. Mother grew up in a community that was half Swiss and half German descent. And she went off to college early and was a teacher of commercial subjects before she married. My father was a farmer, and his father was also in the livery stable business, renting horses and buggies. But my father left school in the 8th grade, and I'm going into detail here because this ties into some of the things that occurred later on in his life. But my father left school in the 8th grade and became a rural mailman. He had his own horse and buggy, and he was assigned to Highland, Illinois, the same town that my mother lived in. And he stabled his horse 1 block from her home. And then his family, in the 1920s, all migrated to Detroit. The farming industry was down, prices were down, there was a farm depression, and his mother, father, all his brothers and sisters went to Detroit, as did he. But whereas they went into the factory for the most part, he studied accounting at night school and went into the business office. And eventually, he moved down to Memphis, Tennessee, and helped open a factory there that made car bodies in Memphis. They made wooden car bodies for automobiles. And the man he was with ran the factory, and my father ran the business side, collecting the money, paying the employees, paying the bills, keeping the inventory, and what have you. Memphis, Tennessee was a very, very southern town in those days, the heart of the South. We lived there for only 3 years because the Depression came, the automobile industry declined, the factory closed. But while he was running the administrative part of the factory, he rented IBM machines to do his accounting. And this was very early in the days when not very many people knew about IBM. And when the factory closed and he lost his job, and he had 2 little children, myself, and by that time my brother Jack had been born, the IBM salesman came to him and said, "Mac, why don't you come to IBM and be a salesman?" My father says, I've never been a salesman. I don't know how to sell. He said, you don't have. What you need to know is what the customer needs, and you know payroll, you know accounts receivable, you know accounts payable. So my father took a job with IBM. And this was fortuitous for all of us. And they moved him to Detroit, where he sold during the Depression. And even during the Depression, he made quota. And they promoted him then in 1936 to North Carolina. And in North Carolina is where Jack and I grew up. First in Greensboro, North Carolina, but then he immediately moved the office to Winston-Salem so that he could sell Reynolds Tobacco Company, which was the big business in town and which started him off on his career. Now, Winston-Salem in 1936 was a very southern town. It was dominated by Reynolds Tobacco. It was dominated by the Moravian Church, and we were looked on as Yankees. And it took a while to get over that reputation. But my brother and I grew up in a close family. We ate our meals together. We went to church on Sunday. We always had Sunday dinner together. We had a lot of friends. My mother and father had a lot of friends. Sometimes we go to the beach at Carolina Beach or at Myrtle Beach. It was a good life. My brother had a bicycle. I had a bicycle. Across the street from us was nothing but woods. It was a whole block that hadn't been developed yet. And the Depression and then ultimately the war kept it from being developed, and we could play in the woods all the time. So we had a really good life. But the war came, and the war came in 1939 in Europe, and of course then Pearl Harbor was in 1941 for all of us. And the war years meant rationing. It meant soldiers everywhere. It meant you couldn't drive too much because of the gas. And I started getting interested very much in history and current events early in the war. And when I was about 10 years old, I started collecting headlines of the war, because the war had just started. And you see here example of the first book, and inside I would put headlines of the day. Now, if I had to do my life over, I'd have added more than a headline. But I had the headline and a date, and I followed the war until I was 16 years old when the war ended. And it was a great learning experience. And to this day, I know about strange islands and secret harbors and what have you, simply because we followed the war. At the same time, during this period, starting about 10 years old, my father had given me a beautiful cigar box. And somebody had presented him with fancy cigars in this thing. And I would collect certain articles and clippings that really would intrigue me. And I would clip them out and put them in this box. And it has not been touched since 1946, when I finished high school. It's very interesting to go through. And as I go through it, I marvel at my interests. Some of them were a little gross because it was wartime. So I was reading all about Mussolini and Hitler and Tojo and Japan and Hirohito, as well as MacArthur and some of our heroes. I was also, during this period of time, very active in the Presbyterian Church and in the youth fellowship. And it was, part church, and it was also heavily social. We met people, we had parties, we had hay rides, we had a really good time. It was during the youth fellowship that I was first elected to something. I'd been a Yankee, I remember, all these years, sort of an outsider. And I beat one of the locals in an election to be president of the youth fellowship. And this was a very big thing in my life at that particular time. We also had summer meetings of youth fellowship where we'd meet and go to a college somewhere, and from all over the state, young Presbyterians would come in. And that's where I first had my first puppy love. I met a young woman named Mary Hayes Barber. And this would have been when I was probably about 14 years old. And interestingly enough, I've had her picture and kept it all these years since that particular point in time. Did not participate in sports, was not interested in sports. And as I look back over my life, I really think that was wrong. I wish I had been more interested, and I wish I had participated. And periodically in these discussions, I'm going to talk about lessons learned. And the lesson right here is, as I look back on it, is that I didn't learn to follow sports the way I should, and I certainly wish I could have. But I had a lot of hobbies, not only the scrapbook things you've seen already, but also chemistry set. I loved doing things with my chemistry set, and had a little room in the basement where I kept my chemistry set. And we made pipe bombs. We'd buy potassium chlorate and charcoal and sulfur, and we would find copper pipe on a few houses that were being built. Not many houses were being built in those days, but there was always one or two. We'd take a little bit of copper pipe, and we'd blow things up in empty lots and so forth. I also collected stamps, and that was something I loved very, very much. Once in a while we had jobs. I had a job delivering newspapers. I had my own route for a while. I was substitute for a long time for a friend. I also worked one winter, over winter holiday when I was in high school, in the produce department of A&P. Went in there at 6 in the morning and got all that stuff out. It was ice cold. Picked peaches another time in the summertime. It was the first time I'd ever worked alongside African Americans. My friend and I had a job. His father had gotten us, and we were with 10 African American guys and 2 of us. And it was hard work, let me tell you. And I didn't eat peaches for 20 years after that, though I do love them now. And then did caddying, particularly for my father, caddying at the country club, and paid $1.25 each time I caddied. And then also, once in a while, people would hire me to help in auctions where they were confiscating property or what have you, and I did that. We had a big family. Most of it was in Illinois, where the folks had come from. So during the war, we didn't see them that often. But when we did see them, we had a great time in Highland. We stayed with our grandparents there. We had 5 or 6 cousins, and we were very, very close to them. And over the years, we've stayed very, very, very close to them. One very interesting thing that I do want to bring up is that IBM was very new in those days, and my father had an office downtown on 4th Street, and I want to show you pictures of that office that he operated out of, and you can see how small it was. It's what we call almost a shoebox office. Here's some of the equipment that they sold, but he, as the war went on, he had to service all of the state of North Carolina, all the state. So he would travel a great deal. And it was very interesting. In those 10 years that we were there, he never lost an account, and slowly but surely sold every major business in North Carolina. I had a hero also towards the end of my high school days, and it happened to be Claire Booth Luce, who was a Republican Congresswoman from Connecticut, a dynamic, good-looking woman. She'd been an actress. She was married to Henry R. Luce, who was one of the most powerful publishers in America. And I saw her as an example of fresh leadership. Interestingly, I've only had 3 or 4 interesting women love affairs in my life, and they were all dynamic and aggressive and leadership-oriented, like Claire Booth Luce was. During the war, a group called the Community Radio Workshop moved to Winston-Salem, and actually it was government funded, and it enabled the community to learn how to do radio work, how to write scripts, and it was run with federal money, and because it was run with federal money, it had to have both African Americans and white people working on it. Up to that point, remember, everything was very segregated, particularly in the South. And I worked with them for a number of years, learned to perform on the radio in a number of shows, and I wrote a series of scripts. And one script was on the United Nations. The United Nations were just being formed at this time. It was a whole new thing. And they accepted my script. And I was very proud of that. But the lady who had started the community radio workshop in Winston-Salem and had been our leader had moved on back to New York City. And she wrote me a letter. Her name was Charlotte Demarest. And I always remember, she said, "Charles, I understand that your United Nations script has been published and you're going to show it on the radio." And she said, "I remember how hard you worked last summer and very proud that you were able to succeed." And I still have that letter because I always remembered, how, first of all, hard work did pay off. That helped. Secondly, the boss who, even though she'd moved away, remembered. And that was another one of these lessons learned, that you appreciate, someone remembering when you've achieved something, and also to be sure you yourself remember to thank people and to compliment them in their day. Well, we graduated from Richard J. Reynolds High School in 1946. The war was over. Millions of GIs, ex-GIs, were moving into the colleges. It was very hard to get into college. My father got me into Duke University. He had been hiring from Duke for a number of years, was very good friends with the person at Duke who helped young men and women get jobs, and so I was lucky to get in. And so we'll now end this part of the life, which was through high school, and we'll talk at another point about Duke University and our life there.